Hey everybody, welcome to another video. I am absolutely excited about this one. This is gonna be on the new 2X DZO Pavos, and just how crazy awesome they are for a modern vintage 2X anamorphic. So let's talk about these little gems right now. Little disclaimer before we get started, just so it's all laid out in the open, we at Northwest Camera Co are a DZO dealer, but don't let that discourage you. We're going to give these a fair and honest evaluation, the good, bad, and the ugly, and we're gonna get into that right now. So, what are the Pavos? Well, the Pavos were announced at NAB this year, 2023, and to a lot of debate. Everyone was excited by them. Look at how these look. This is, in my opinion, the best exterior looking anamorphic lens that's maybe ever been made. I absolutely love the way these look. People were very excited about them, but they had loads of pincushion distortion and they didn't flare a whole lot. So DZO got a lot of pretty much overwhelming negative feedback at NAB, but DZO as a company is fantastic at listening to customer feedback. And in the grand scheme of things, it is better to sell lenses than to not sell lenses. So they went back to the drawing board and they came out with the version 2 of the Pavos, which have loads of barrel distortion and kind of a lot of wild characteristics, very similar to the new Atlas Mercuries. I think this was a very smart decision because DZO, I'm sure, saw how much attention the Mercuries were getting and wanted to make something that had a lot of character as well. Now, in the grand scheme of modern anamorphics that have a vintage look, there's not really a whole lot on the market. Up until this point, it really was the Atlas Orions at a 2X, and even then, I would say they still trended towards more of a modern look than a vintage look, and these are full-on, kind of everything you want from an older looking lens, but with all the convenience of a modern lens, easy to service, readily available parts, things like that. So, the Pavos, what do they have that makes them have that more vintage look? Well, to start, just tons of barrel distortion, that really typical fall off that you get in that kind of oval center, watching the focus kind of melt away around the outsides. It's not extreme, it's not excessive, but it's there and it's nice and subtle. Also, there's a couple flare options. They have the traditional blue flare as well as a more neutral silver version as well. And these lenses are very tiny and very lightweight for a 2X anamorphic that covers well past Super 35. Right now, this camera straight ahead, we're shooting 6x5 on the Raptor at 8K, which is a good bit taller than a traditional Super 35. Not quite as tall as something like a 3x2 on the Mini LF or the Venice, but close, really good coverage. You wouldn't even need a 1.6 expander to cover full frame. 1.4 is really all you would need to get you the rest of the way there, but pleasantly, they cover a lot already on a lot of cameras that are out in most of their max resolutions. So that's a really big plus for these Pavos. We're gonna start with some pros and cons first, and let's just go with the cons and get those out of the way. But keep watching because there's a ton of pros and a lot of great looking footage coming up next. First off, they're not cheap. They're not expensive in the grand scheme of things, but they're not cheap. Roughly, a set of 6 is gonna set you back around $30,000. Up until this point, if you said you could have 6 great new modern anamorphics for 30 grand, that would be great. But as things are getting cheaper, 30K sounds a little expensive, but it's 6 lenses. It's kind of easy to make an A set, a B set, or rent all 6 for not an insane rental price. So I think that's kind of a pro and a con. The other con that I have with these is I wish they flared just a little bit more. We have the blue flare versions here that we purchased, and I wanted something that did flare a little bit more. Most of the neutral lenses on the Proteus and Anamorphs and some other lenses of that nature, I feel like the neutrals just don't flare as much, so I really wanted something that had an amplified flare. So we went with the blue, which is nice. The other con, there's gonna be some chromatic aberration wide open, but really it's going to be when you're in dense foresty areas. We've got a lot of out of focus speculars, and that barrel distortions are like really working to kind of pull all those shapes apart. I feel like you notice it a lot if you're looking for it. I don't think the average viewer is gonna see it and think it's a big deal, but it is there in the right circumstances. That being said, once you move into interiors and some other places, I don't feel like that CA pops up really anywhere in any sort of noticeable way. The breathing, they breathe a little bit. It's not as extreme as say the Mercuries and some other old vintage lenses. I put them on par with the Atlas Orions in terms of how they breathe. Not nearly as well controlled as say the Proteus, but it's not distracting in any way. They just breathe, which is a thing with Anamorphics, so just expect that. The last con that I really have about these, which we'll see in our testing, is they're just a little bit soft, wide open. I would say that these are very similar to the Orions, in which we're gonna test back-to-back later. They sharpen up pretty fast as you hit 2.8 and 4, but if you were used to working with the Orions, you're gonna see very similar performance from these across the T-stop range, which at this point, it's nice that we have the Orions as a baseline, because if you're used to working with those, you'll feel very comfortable and familiar with the Pavos. Okay, let's get into the pros. The biggest pro of these is that they really do have some really classic, interesting looking vintage style to the look. Lots of barrel distortion. It gets pretty wild. It's fun. It's not overbearing where your horizon starts to like move and tip, but you do get like a lot of barrel distortion. It's just on the edge. If you wanted to neutralize that in post, you could probably save a little bit of that, but it's just on the edge of kind of what is allowable with post correction, which I like. And it is nice that the barrel distortion does go through all of the focal lengths. It's not just on the wide, so you do get to have that consistency across your focal lengths, which is great. Another big pro, and this isn't really about the lenses, but this set is launching almost as a full set right off the bat with 6 focal lengths. So the only one that is lagging behind is the 100mm, which should be out by Christmas of this year. But to start with 5 full focal lengths going 28, 32, 40, 55, 75 gives you a broad range across multiple formats on how you want to shoot these to really choose and dictate exactly how you want. You've got a nice wide, a couple mids, something telephoto, and then once that 100 comes out, this is gonna be a really, really solid set. We got all 6 here because I feel like that is just the way you wanna have it when you're shooting anamorphic. Wides, tights, you know, something in the middle for an over the shoulder. It gives you everything that you want to shoot your narrative, as well as having loads of flexibility if you're doing commercial or corporate work with these as well. Another pro that's really cool about these is just like the Proteus, they have the built-in back focus adjustment mechanism here as well. So if you're used to dealing with anamorphics, trying to shim these is kind of a pain in the ass and takes a while if you are doing this with other lenses. So to have this built in is gonna save everybody a lot of time getting these dialed in for the best sharpness and performance and hitting all your marks and ensuring those are accurate. Just makes things a little bit easier on everyone. Another pro is the coverage. They market these as Super 35, which I think is very good. They definitely perform fantastically on Super 35, but there's a load of coverage past that that you can shoot on a number of different sensors that really will start to exacerbate all of the weird characteristics you start getting around the edge of frame if you really want them to have that funky, dirty, wild look across the edge of frame. That's why I've been really enjoying shooting these on the Raptor because you can have a lot of flexibility there with how you want your image to look, and I love it.
All right, y'all, we're just gonna look at some coverage to see what these Pavos actually cover. Now, they're rated at Super 35, so we're just gonna scroll through a few of these formats and see just how much they cover and beyond. Now, we've shot a lot of stuff on the Raptor in 8K and 6x5 mode and 1x1 with 2x, which is really cool, using the full height of that sensor. But let's see how that compares to the Super 35 format. So first, we're gonna look at the VistaVision Raptor versus just a standard 4x3 on the Mini, the Alexa Mini, which is very typical, and we've all used this quite a bit. From here, we're gonna move to a smaller format, which is the Super 35 4x3 on the Komodo X. Quite a big difference between the standard Alexa Mini in 4x3 and the Komodo X in a 4x3. And then from there, we'll go down and we'll check out the new Alexa 35 in a 3.3K mode in 6x5. as well. Still, Raptor a good bit larger coverage-wise than the Alexa 35. From here, we're going to move into some open gate modes. We're just going to look at Raptor versus Venice, and it is, you know, Raptor's still a bit taller when you're shooting in the 6x5 modes than Venice, but if you do move into open gate, you do see that the Venice is quite a bit taller and wider in 3x2 mode than the Raptor. Similarly, if you look at the Mini LF, the Mini LF is going to be quite a bit larger as well, both vertically and horizontally when you're shooting in that same 3x2 open gate mode. So again, thanks to Phil Holland for this format capture and compare tool. This thing is always super useful. And let's get back into the video.
Coming up on the last pros, size. It is hard to argue with how tiny and compact these little suckers are. They're 95mm fronts. Everything is very lightweight. The mechanics are fantastic. I really have nothing to complain about whatsoever after using these a little bit. It just makes shooting a breeze with how small and tiny and compact these are. The 75 is only just slightly larger than this 32. Same thing with the 100. And if you're used to seeing like the size of the Proteus or even the Atlas 100, it is remarkable how much smaller these are, which just makes things easier if you're gonna travel on a job. I packed all a 3-lens set of these and took them to North Carolina, and like they fit in just a little part of a backpack. It was fantastic. Last but not least, the biggest pro is that classic oozing look of old school Anamorphics. Wild barrel distortion. I really don't think that from a modern lens, anything really gets you closer to that swirly kind of hawk Panavision look of decades ago like these lenses. Now, the big thing is the flares. You're not gonna get the same flares that you get from those, but those were large front scope Anamorphics, and you get a lot of fun characteristics with the flares from that type of lens. Here though, you're getting a little more subdued flare characteristic, but with pretty much everything else matching, which is, I mean, I have zero to complain about in that aspect. Now we're just gonna get into the more boring side of things. This is just gonna be the standard studio testing, and we're gonna test these by themselves at a couple different T-stops. We're gonna see some comparisons, and then we'll kind of test these back to back with the Atlas Orions, as well as maybe the Proteus, just to give you a vibe of what's kind of in this realm. Now I just want to move into something that I feel like is going to be talked about a lot, which is the Pavos versus the Atlas Mercuries. I would say both of these sets are going to have what I would call wild characteristics in quite a few ways. Not so much the best performing lenses, but it's more about a wild, interesting aesthetic. And these two are going to get compared, I feel like, pretty frequently because of the two lenses that are out on the market right now. These two by far have the most of those kind of wild characteristics. So let's just kind of go back and forth. Both lenses win on a size comparison. They're both gonna be lightweight, easy, and very nice to use in that regard. Now let's just talk about the flares. I would say personally, and this is just my opinion, I don't necessarily enjoy the flares from either set of lenses. I think the Atlas Mercuries have, maybe in the right circumstance, more appealing, traditional looking flares, but they're insanely hard to control, and for a lot of stuff, it becomes very time consuming to try to wrangle those back in, and they're not consistent from lens to lens. The Pavos are, while blue, it's a very subtle blue. We'll show you just a quick couple examples right here. But when they say blue, it's more of a silvery blue, very desaturated. I almost want more blue saturation in there, and maybe some more of the kind of double line movement that you get from some more traditional Anamorphics. That being said, again, when you actually are shooting, those flares don't pop up super duper often, so it's not the end of the world. But flares, I call that a wash, because I personally don't like either of them myself. Now, let's just talk about performance really quickly. And we're just gonna touch on a couple things. Chromatic aberration, breathing, and area of sharpness across the frame. Now, when you're shooting 1.5 on the Raptor, I honestly feel like there's less sharpness across the board on the Mercuries than there is shooting a 2x lens on the Pavos. You still do get that really nice fall off, both, horizontally and vertically, but I feel like that happens much sooner and closer to the crosshairs on the Mercuries. So if you are shooting full frame mode on them, I feel like you're a little boxed in with where your sharpness is on those lenses, where I feel like you have a little more flexibility on the Pavos. Now let's talk about the bokeh really quick, just before we get into some of the others. The Mercuries, I feel like, do have maybe more pleasant looking bokeh, with the exception that you really need to be at close focus. Since we're at a 1.5, you really need to be able to throw that out of focus a lot to see some of that more traditional oval looking stuff you'd expect from Anamorphics. That being said though, with the Pavos at 2x, it's easier to be further away from your subject and get more of that stretch and field of view that you would get from a more traditional looking anamorphic. Now, being that the Pavos do have a 2x stretch and similar barrel distortion to the Mercuries, what you're gonna see once you get into dense foliage, which we'll play some clips here, is because you're getting that barrel and a pretty extreme stretch, you're gonna pretty much always lose that classic oval shape, because that oval is now being pulled and stretched with that distortion. So if you're expecting that traditional oval, it might only really happen in non-foliagey areas with a telephoto lens like the 75. Once you get on any of the wider lenses, I feel like you're really just not going to see that no matter how hard you try. That being said, that is an interesting look. And if you're about character from that aspect, I feel like the Mercuries and the Pavos are gonna get you some interesting looks. I feel like you're going to get more of that anamorphic look with the Pavos, just solely based on their squeeze factor, and the fact that you can kind of play with your depth and distance from subjects to get that stretchy, waterfall-y bokeh out of that lens versus the Mercuries. If you're talking about breathing first on these lenses, I'd say these are comparable. The only thing I like more about the Pavos is that breathing is consistent across all the focal lengths, whereas the Mercuries have a very big breathing issue on the 36 versus as you get into the 54, the 72, that starts to mellow out. I'd say the wides on this breathe less than the 36, but they do breathe, but it's consistent, and that just comes down to, do you want that consistency? Do you not? I feel like if you're doing green screen or volume, the consistency plays in pretty nicely there, because the mapping is very similar across the board. You're not having to do like tons of individual stuff like you would be on the Mercuries. But that is breathing. Chromatic aberration, I feel like it's gonna be about the same on both lenses. I will say that because you get the 2x squeeze, like I was saying before, you might notice some of that CA in some of the like foliage and speculars a little more when you're shooting in some like deep foresty areas. But I would say similar performance across the board once you get into real practical shooting with them. Mechanics on both lenses feel good. I will say we've shot these lenses on 5 different cameras now, and the gear placement on these is just overall better than the Mercuries. It allows ease of use for pretty much any camera system, where we did run into some issues on the Mercuries just with where the gear placement sits on a few, what I would call like industry standard style cameras. Rigging is a little bit easier with them, so that's nice. Another thing, the Mercuries do not have the built-in back focus adjustment, so if you did need to do anything with those, you would need to shim them. So that one kind of swings towards the Pavos. Now let's talk about pricing. The pricing between the two is currently, if you got in on a pre-order on the Atlas, they're about the same. If you did not get in on a pre-order, the Mercuries are gonna be sitting around $8,000 a piece, whereas these are going to be roughly in the $4,500 to $5,000 range, depending on when you buy, if they're specials, things of that nature. That being said though, anamorphic is already niche. These do not rent out as much as spherical lenses as a whole. So the more you spend, the longer it takes you to make back your investment. These are 2x, more focals available. Might be easier to rent these out for the first couple years until the Mercuries come out with more focal lengths in that set as well. That's just a little comparison for the business side of things, but something to keep in mind when you're spending this much money on lenses. Okay, I'm just gonna throw this to Galen real quick and get his opinion, because his opinion might be different than mine on what he thought of these on his short film.
All right, so I shot my 48 on the Pavos, and we had a blast. It was a lot of fun. My whole crew was basically gathered around the monitor looking at how cool the lenses were. People who didn't even understand really much about lenses constantly commented on how amazing they looked, which was sweet. We really loved the size, the versatility, the range, and especially the wonderful barrel distortion that we got. We were doing something kind of somewhat science fiction-y, but also kind of like scary action, so it really fit the narrative that we were trying to tell, which was great. And I think the reason that I ended up like wanting to shoot on these lenses really came down to that very old school Panavision feel. It's something that I think we all see in movies and kind of point it out and know what it looks like, but then it's kind of this understood thing that it's like, unless you're at a certain like tier production and price point, you really just can't get that look. So it was a lot of fun to have access to that and get to play around with these lenses. So we're playing some footage over it, but yeah, they were a blast. And I mean, much like Dominic's critique, I think seeing some more flares would be cool, but that's honestly my only gripe. And it's in comparison to all the other gripes I've had with other lenses, it's the least amount of complaints I feel like I've had for any set. So as of now, these are probably my favorite set. And yeah, it's hard to top them. They're pretty awesome. So with that, I'll pass back to Dom, and he'll take it from here.
All right, everybody, thanks for watching. I know this was a long video, but they're expensive lenses. If you're considering buying these, we always like to make these as in-depth as possible because, hey, let's be real, spending a lot of money is kind of a big decision. So we want to give you as much of an insight to these as possible, both aesthetically, mechanically, business-wise, to help you make the best decision you can. So with that, thanks for watching. Remember, like and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time.